In February 1840, a 20-year-old woman stood in front of a mirror in Buckingham Palace, about to make a decision that would outlast her entire empire. Her name was Victoria. She was the Queen of England, and in a few days she was going to marry Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Tradition demanded a certain kind of dress for a moment like this. Royal brides were supposed to wear silver, heavy ceremonial gowns dripping with jewels, practically wearable armor announcing wealth and dynasty to every foreign ambassador in the room. Victoria said no. She chose white. That single decision, a fabric choice made by one stressed-out bride 2 centuries ago, would eventually convince millions of women across dozens of cultures that white was the only correct color for a wedding. But here is the part almost nobody knows. Brides had been wearing white for thousands of years before Victoria. They just were not doing it to look pure. In some cases, they were doing it to survive their own wedding. And in large parts of the world, for most of history, white was not the wedding color at all. In some places, it was the color of death. Let us go back much further, because the story people usually tell, white equals virginity, skips almost the entire history of the color. In ancient Rome, brides did wear something white, a garment called the tunica recta, woven in one continuous piece on an upright loom in a specific ritual technique meant to invoke old-fashioned domestic virtue, the kind associated with the earliest generations of Roman matrons. But the color of the tunic was not actually the centerpiece of the outfit. The real showstopper was a veil, and it was not white at all. It was called the flammeum, a bright flame orange fabric that covered the bride's face and shoulders almost entirely. Roman writers described marriage as one of the most spiritually dangerous transitions a woman could undergo, moving out from under the protection of her father's household gods into an entirely new family with its own gods, its own ancestors, and its own risks. The flammeum was not decorative, it was protective, meant to shield the bride from evil spirits during the crossing between households. Some historians connect the orange-red color to fire itself, associated with the hearth goddess Vesta and the symbolic idea of carrying protective flame into a new home. So the earliest documented white-adjacent bridal look in Western history was mostly white by accident, a tunic underneath, with the real symbolic power sitting entirely in a different color layered on top. Move forward 1,000 years into medieval Europe, and color choice had almost nothing to do with symbolism at all. It had to do with money. Wealthy brides wore whatever their richest, rarest fabric happened to be. Deep reds from expensive madder or kermes dye, the same crimson so treasured it was sometimes restricted by sumptuary law to nobility alone. Blues from woad, or for the extremely wealthy, imported indigo, a pigment so costly it occasionally rivaled silver in price by weight. Occasionally black, dyed with iron gall, which was surprisingly difficult and expensive to produce evenly across an entire bolt of cloth without streaking or fading unevenly in sunlight. A bride in a vivid, saturated color was not announcing anything about her virtue. She was announcing that her family could afford a dye process that most of the village could never replicate, sometimes involving materials imported from thousands of miles away along fragile, expensive trade routes. Poor brides, meanwhile, simply wore their existing best dress, whatever color that happened to be, and then kept wearing that same dress afterward as their regular good outfit, for church, for feast days, for every important occasion for years to come. Nobody bought a garment specifically for one single day. That idea had not been invented yet and would not exist in any meaningful, widespread sense for centuries. Interestingly, there is one documented case that complicates the Victoria story even further, and most people have never heard of it. In 1499, roughly 340 years before Victoria's wedding, Anne of Brittany married King Louis XIV of France, wearing a gown described in court records as white and gold, chosen deliberately to represent purity and her role as Duchess in her own right, not merely as a royal wife. It is, as far as historians can tell, the earliest clearly documented instance of a European bride choosing white specifically to symbolize virtue rather than wealth or accident. But it was a single, isolated royal event. It did not spark a trend. There was no illustrated press to spread the image, no magazine to codify the rule, no department store to sell the aspiration to anyone outside the French court. It simply happened once, was recorded by chroniclers, and then vanished from popular memory for over 3 centuries, a reminder that a single act, without the right media and commercial machinery behind it, does not automatically become a tradition. Victoria's version worked precisely because the timing lined up with a communications revolution that Anne of Brittany never had access to. So when does white actually start meaning something on a wider scale? Renaissance Europe. And the reasoning is stranger than most people expect. Occasionally, wealthy Italian and French brides chose white specifically because it was the hardest color in existence to keep clean. Linen and silk in pure white would show every smudge of dirt, every wine stain, every trace of travel by carriage or on foot, every fingerprint left by an unsupervised servant. Wearing one was a silent, obvious flex. It proved the bride had servants to launder and press the garment constantly, a private carriage so she never had to walk through mud, and a household wealthy enough that she never had to perform manual labor while wearing it. White was not about innocence, it was about visible, impractical wealth. The exact same logic, incidentally, behind why the ultra-rich today still gravitate toward white sofas, white countertops, and white cars. Nothing communicates "I do not clean up after myself" quite like a fabric that reveals every single stain within minutes. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, at least 2 entirely different color systems were developing completely independently, and they tell us something important about how arbitrary these symbols really are. In China, brides for over 2,000 years have traditionally worn red, a color associated with luck, joy, fertility, and warding off evil, essentially the exact symbolic role that white would later play in the West. The traditional quan kwa, a red silk wedding outfit embroidered with gold dragons and phoenixes, remains a fixture of Chinese weddings even today, often layered underneath or alongside a modern white Western gown during the course of a single multi-outfit ceremony, brides sometimes changing costume 3 or 4 times across one event. In India, brides across most regions and religions traditionally wear red or deep maroon saris or lehengas, again tied to fertility, prosperity, and marital luck, frequently paired with elaborate henna patterns that themselves carry symbolic weight about the strength of the marriage and, according to folk belief, the affection of the mother-in-law. In many of these cultures, white was historically avoided entirely at weddings because it was the color specifically associated with mourning and funerals, the exact opposite emotional register a wedding was supposed to carry. And then there's Japan, which offers maybe the strangest twist of all, because Japan also has an ancient tradition of white wedding attire, entirely independent of anything happening in Europe, and it means something almost completely opposite to what Victorian magazines would later claim. The Shiromuku, a pure white kimono traditionally worn for the Shinto ceremony portion of a Japanese wedding, dates back centuries before any Western contact. But the white was never primarily about virginity. It symbolized the bride's death to her birth family and her rebirth into her husband's household, a blank slate she would color with the customs of her new family, similar in some ways to the way a Shinto shrine's white robes signal spiritual purity and a fresh beginning. Traditionally, the bride would change into colorful robes later in the celebration, symbolizing that transformation actively taking place before the guests. So here we have two civilizations, Victorian England and pre-modern Japan, arriving independently at the same color for a wedding dress, white, while assigning it almost entirely different meanings. One about sexual purity performed for a congregation, the other about symbolic death and rebirth into a new family structure. Put a Chinese bride in 1600, a Japanese bride in 1700, an Indian bride in 1700, and a European bride in 1750 next to each other, and you would find four completely different color philosophies, each considered by its own culture to be the obvious, natural, self-evidently correct choice. There was no universal human instinct toward bridal white. There were several independent regional traditions carrying wildly different meanings, and the West's eventual global dominance of the white gown was simply one branch among many that happened later to spread through sheer economic and media power rather than any inherent symbolic truth. Back in Europe, there is one more wrinkle worth mentioning before we get to Victoria properly, because it complicates the myth even further. Blue, not white, was actually considered the primary color of purity in medieval and early modern Christian Europe, largely because of its association with the Virgin Mary, who was almost always depicted in religious art wearing blue robes, a convention so consistent across centuries of European painting that art historians can often date a fresco just by the specific shade of blue pigment used. Many brides in this period, when they could afford any special color at all, chose blue specifically to invoke that association, and the tradition survived long enough to be folded into the well-known wedding rhyme, "Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue," which dates back at least to a Victorian-era folk verse from Lancashire, England. The blue detail was not an afterthought tacked on to a white dress tradition. For centuries, it was arguably a more direct, more theologically loaded symbol of purity than white ever managed to be. Which brings us back to the woman who actually mattered for global popularization, though maybe not for the reason you would assume. When Victoria rejected the traditional silver gown for her 1840 wedding, she was not making a statement about purity at all. She had two very specific, very practical motivations. First, she wanted a gown that photographed and illustrated well against her notably small, unimposing frame, since heavy silver brocade tended to visually swallow her in engravings and paintings, and she was acutely conscious of how young and slight she looked next to a taller, more commanding-looking husband. Second, and more importantly, she wanted to make an economic statement. She commissioned a gown made from Honiton lace, handcrafted by artisans in the Devon countryside, an industry that had been collapsing for decades as cheaper machine-made lace flooded the market from France and Belgium, putting hundreds of skilled English lacemakers out of work and threatening to erase generations of specialized craft knowledge entirely. Victoria's dress was not a purity statement. It was closer to an economic rescue mission, a royal endorsement dressed up as a wedding gown, specifically engineered to save British jobs and signal support for domestic industry at a moment of real economic anxiety across the country. Here is the twist almost nobody expects. It barely worked, at least not immediately. Victoria's wedding was covered extensively by newspapers and the newly booming illustrated press, which was exploding in circulation across Britain at precisely that historical moment, thanks to advances in printing technology and a growing literate middle class hungry for royal gossip and detailed descriptions of court fashion. Engravings of her white lace gown spread everywhere, reprinted in periodicals across Europe and eventually the United States within weeks. Upper-class women eager to appear fashionable and modern began copying the look for their own weddings almost immediately. But it took decades, not days, for the trend to filter down beyond the aristocracy. A dress meant to be worn exactly once and never again was, for most of the 19th century, an almost absurd luxury. Working class and even solidly middle-class families simply could not justify spending money on a garment with a single use, when that same money could buy a dress meant to serve for years of ordinary wear afterward. For most of that century, white weddings remained a status symbol restricted almost entirely to the upper classes, the Renaissance logic all over again, just with dramatically better publicity behind it this time around. The real acceleration into the middle classes came from an unexpected direction: etiquette books and lifestyle magazines. In 1849, one especially influential American publication, Godey's Ladies' Book, explicitly instructed its readers that white was, quote, the most fitting hue for a bride, regardless of her social standing, and tied the color directly and explicitly to purity and innocence for what appears to be the first time in mass-market print. This is the exact moment historians point to as the true manufacturing of the white equals virgin myth. Not ancient tradition, not Victoria's original economic intention, not the isolated case of Anne of Brittany centuries earlier. A 19th-century American women's magazine doing precisely what lifestyle magazines still do today, inventing a rule out of thin air and marketing it as ancient, timeless wisdom that readers were simply late in discovering. The idea calcified rapidly through the Victorian era's broader obsession with respectability and female virtue as a kind of public performance. A white dress became a visible certificate, worn in front of an entire congregation of witnesses. Wear it, and you were publicly announcing your moral standing to every relative, every neighbor, every person seated in the pews behind you. It is a strange thing to build an entire moral framework around, a fabric choice originally made because a queen wanted good press for a struggling lace industry. But cultural symbolism has never required internal logic. It only requires repetition. And by the late 1800s, the repetition was relentless, appearing in etiquette columns, serialized romance novels, church sermons about feminine virtue, and the earliest mail-order catalogs reaching farm families far outside major cities. Not everyone fell in line, though, and the exceptions are worth knowing about. Some American brides in the mid to late 1800s deliberately chose colors other than white as a form of practicality or even quiet rebellion, wearing deep blues, soft grays, or muted browns that could be worn again for church or formal visits afterward. Mourning customs of the era occasionally overlapped with weddings too. A bride who had recently lost a close family member sometimes wore lavender or gray rather than bright white, blending the visual language of half mourning with the celebration of marriage in a single carefully chosen outfit. These variations remind us that even at the height of the white dress craze, plenty of real brides simply could not or would not participate fully in the trend the magazines were selling. By the early 20th century, department stores and the newly emerging ready-to-wear bridal industry recognized a genuine commercial opportunity and moved on it aggressively. Manufacturing costs for fine white fabric dropped sharply as industrial looms improved and synthetic dye processes made bright, stable whites far cheaper to produce than they had ever been in previous centuries. A white gown no longer required custom silk work reserved for the aristocracy. A middle-class bride could now afford something close enough to the old aristocratic ideal, and the wedding industry, still in its infancy but growing fast, actively pushed the narrative that a proper wedding absolutely required a proper white dress, framing it as an ancient obligation rather than what it actually was, a recent and highly profitable retail invention barely 60 years old at that point. World War I briefly slowed the momentum, much the same way it interrupted corsets and countless other fashion norms, as fabric and labor were redirected toward the war effort, and lavish personal spending felt culturally inappropriate against a backdrop of national sacrifice. But it was World War II that truly disrupted the pattern. Fabric rationing across Britain, the United States, and most of continental Europe made silk and fine satin nearly impossible to obtain for for civilian, non-military use, the same wartime material shortage that had once, a generation earlier, forced women out of steel-boned corsets and into factory work entirely. Brides during the war years improvised constantly. Some used repurposed parachute silk, which had a strange, almost mythical status among wartime brides for its soft drape and pale cream-white color, occasionally salvaged directly from a husband's or brother's own military service overseas. Others borrowed dresses from sisters, cousins, or even strangers through informal community lending networks, sometimes passing the same gown between a dozen different brides over the course of a single wartime year, each one altering it slightly before returning it. Some simply dyed and refashioned whatever fabric was already sitting in a closet, turning curtains, tablecloths, or old formal wear into something resembling a wedding dress on very short notice. For several years, the so-called traditional white wedding dress simply was not available to most ordinary people, quiet proof that the tradition had always been far more flexible, far more recent, and far more optional than the marketing had ever admitted. If you're finding this as strange as I did researching it, go ahead and hit subscribe because there's a lot more of this kind of hidden history coming every week. Then the post-war economic boom hit, and the white wedding dress did not simply return, it exploded into a genuine industry of its own. The 1950s saw the rise of dedicated bridal boutiques, national bridal magazines with circulation numbers that rivaled major general interest fashion publications, and an entire new retail category built specifically around the idea that a wedding dress was a singular, sacred, once-in-a-lifetime purchase, worn for a few hours, photographed extensively, and never worn again, sometimes preserved in a specially made box for decades as a kind of quasi-religious keepsake object, occasionally even passed down to a daughter who would never actually wear it herself. Designers took notice too. Christian Dior's New Look silhouette of 1947, with its cinched waist and dramatically full skirt, gave 1950s wedding gowns their distinctive voluminous shape, a shape that still echoes through countless ball gown-style dresses sold today, more than 70 years later. Hollywood accelerated the trend even further. Grace Kelly's 1956 wedding to Prince Rainier of Monaco was photographed and broadcast with an intensity rivaling an actual royal coronation. Her Helen Rose-designed gown, with its high lace neckline, long sleeves, and full skirt, becoming the visual template that an entire generation of brides, raised on television and glossy film magazines, would spend the next several decades trying to recreate. The dress was, in a very real sense, product placement for an entire cultural expectation, and it worked spectacularly well. Bridal magazine subscriptions climbed, department store bridal salons multiplied across American suburbs, and the phrase wedding dress increasingly meant one specific silhouette in one specific color, regardless of a bride's actual cultural background or family tradition. The later 20th century brought its own twists and reversals. The counterculture movements of the 1960s and 1970s saw some brides deliberately rejecting the formal white gown altogether, opting instead for flowing bohemian dresses, colorful prints, or even trousers, framing the choice explicitly as a rejection of the commercialized, tradition-obsessed wedding industry that had built up around Victoria's original accidental innovation more than a century earlier. It was, in its own small way, an echo of the dress reform movements that had once fought against the corset, another generation deciding that the previous era's supposedly timeless rule was actually just a recent invention worth discarding entirely. By the 1980s, though, the pendulum swung firmly back, fueled by a new wave of celebrity royal weddings, most famously Princess Diana's enormous, puff-sleeved 1981 gown, watched by an estimated global television audience in the hundreds of millions, reinforcing the white ball gown ideal for yet another generation, almost 150 years after Victoria first wore something similar for entirely different reasons. The final major shift came from the fashion industry itself, when Vera Wang, unable to find a gown she liked for her own 1989 wedding, opened her own bridal salon the following year and began pushing back against the idea that a wedding dress had to be stark, bright white at all. Wang popularized softer shades like ivory, champagne, and blush across the 1990s and 2000s, arguing that different skin tones and personal styles deserved different interpretations of the tradition, effectively reopening a conversation about bridal color that had been largely closed since Godey's Ladies' Book declared its rule in 1849. In the 21st century, with globalization and social media accelerating cultural exchange at a pace no 19th century magazine editor could have imagined, brides increasingly blend traditions rather than choosing one, wearing a white Western-style gown for part of the ceremony and a red quan qua or a colorful sari for another portion of the same event, treating the old rigid rules as optional building blocks rather than binding law. So what actually happened here when you zoom all the way out? A protective orange veil in ancient Rome, worn for spiritual safety rather than symbolism, a dye-based wealth flex in the medieval and Renaissance periods where color signaled money, not morality, an isolated, forgotten instance of symbolic white in 1499 France, centuries ahead of its time and without the media infrastructure to spread it. A parallel red tradition across China and India, developing completely independently with its own equally sincere symbolic logic, still practiced by billions of people today. An entirely separate white tradition in Japan, meaning death and rebirth rather than virginity. A quieter blue tradition in medieval Christian Europe, arguably a more direct symbol of purity than white ever managed to be. A queen's economic favor to a dying lace industry in 1840, misread by history as a purity statement. A magazine's invented rule in 1849, repeated until it hardened into apparent ancient fact. A department store's marketing strategy in the early 1900s, dressed up as tradition. A wartime interruption that briefly exposed how flexible the whole system actually was. A film industry's visual branding in the 1950s, cementing the final look for decades. A brief countercultural rebellion in the 1960s and 70s, followed by an even bigger royal wedding-fueled resurgence in the 1980s. A designer's quiet revolution in the 1990s, reopening the palette. A dozen completely different eras, a dozen completely different underlying reasons, all collapsing in the popular imagination into one single modern belief, that white has always meant purity and that brides have always worn it. Neither claim is true. What is actually true is more interesting. Every generation dressed its brides according to whatever that particular era valued most: protection, wealth, morality, glamour, rebellion, nostalgia, individuality, and every single generation was absolutely convinced that its own version was the ancient, unquestionable original. Fragments of Queen Victoria's original Honiton lace still survive today, carefully preserved in museum collections and studied by textile historians who can trace the exact workshop and even the individual lace makers who produced it. She never set out to invent a global tradition. She wanted good lace, good publicity for a struggling regional industry, and a dress that photographed well next to a much taller husband on a day she was already nervous about. 2 centuries later, millions of brides around the world, across cultures that never shared her history, her religion, or her reasoning, put on a color she chose almost by accident, utterly convinced they are honoring something ancient, sacred, and eternal. They are not. They are, whether they realize it or not, echoing one 20-year-old's very specific fashion decision from a cold Wednesday morning in London in February of 1840, amplified by a magazine, sold by a department store, broadcast by Hollywood, and quietly rewritten by a single designer a century and a half later, until an accident became an institution nobody remembers questioning.